this costume shows up every Halloween. It's in horror games, metal album covers, and haunted houses. Everyone treats it as the creepiest look in history. Here's what almost nobody realizes: it wasn't a costume. It was PPE. Personal protective equipment, designed by an actual physician, using the best available germ theory of the 1600s, centuries before anyone had heard the word pandemic. Every single part of this outfit had a specific medical function. Today we're breaking down the actual engineering behind history's most misunderstood uniform. Today, this image is pure horror aesthetic. It shows up as a villain design, a spooky decoration, a shock value profile picture. And that makes sense, it's a genuinely unsettling shape. A long black beak, round glass eyes, a wide-brimmed hat, a full-length leather coat. But this design didn't come from a horror artist. It came from a French physician named Charles Delorme, around 1619, who was serving as a doctor to French royalty during recurring outbreaks of bubonic plague across Europe. At the time, doctors had no concept of bacteria or viruses. Nobody knew Yersinia pestis, the actual bacterium responsible for plague, even existed, that wouldn't be identified until 1894. So the prevailing medical theory of the era was something called miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, particularly foul-smelling air from rot, waste, and decay. Wrong theory. But here's the twist: the equipment built around that wrong theory was actually a surprisingly sophisticated attempt at what we'd now call barrier protection. Let's break down exactly how. Charles Delorme wasn't some random tradesman guessing at fashion. He was one of the most respected physicians in France, eventually serving as chief physician to King Louis XIII. When plague outbreaks kept killing the doctors treating patients, he set out to solve a real occupational safety problem: how do you treat contagious patients without becoming the next victim? His solution combined the medical theory of the time with practical, physical barriers, essentially building an early hazmat suit centuries before that term existed. And once you understand miasma theory, every single piece of this design suddenly makes sense, not as fashion, but as function. Let's go through it, piece by piece. Start with the most iconic feature, the long, bird-like beak. This wasn't decorative, it was functional storage. Physicians packed the beak with strongly scented substances, dried flowers, herbs like mint and lavender, spices, even things like camphor or myrrh. Since miasma theory blamed disease on bad-smelling air, the logic was straightforward: filter the air through pleasant, strong-smelling material before it reached the doctor's nose. It's the wrong mechanism. They weren't filtering out bacteria, but the basic instinct of put a physical filtration barrier between yourself and contaminated air isn't actually far off from how modern respirator filters work. Next, the round glass eyepieces. These created a sealed barrier around the eyes. Some versions were even tinted red, because red glass was believed at the time to help protect against harmful vapors. Functionally, this was one of the only parts of the human face doctors couldn't otherwise cover, and glass lenses meant doctors could still see their patients while keeping that entry point sealed off. Put together, the mask wasn't a spooky design choice. It was the 17th century's version of an air-filtering respirator with integrated eye protection, built entirely around the wrong germ theory, but structurally doing something surprisingly close to right. Now the rest of the outfit. The full-length coat, usually made of heavy leather or waxed canvas, covered the body from neck to ankle. The goal was simple: minimize any exposed skin that could come into contact with a patient, their bodily fluids, or contaminated fabric and bedding. Thick leather gloves and boots sealed off the hands and feet, the parts of the body most likely to make direct contact during an examination. The coat was often treated or coated in wax, which we now know would have provided a genuinely useful barrier against fleas, the actual carriers of the bacteria that spread plague, even though doctors at the time had no idea that fleas were the real culprit. Then there's the cane. Doctors used it for two practical reasons: to examine patients, lifting clothing or pointing at symptoms, without direct touch, and to keep a physical distance from the people they were treating. It's a strikingly early version of a concept we now recognize immediately: social distancing. The wide-brimmed hat, meanwhile, signaled the wearer's profession from a distance, a visual warning system letting people know a physician, not a random stranger, had entered a contaminated space. Full coverage. Filtered air intake. Sealed eyewear. Distance tools. That is, functionally, barrier medicine, just built on a mistaken theory of how disease actually spread. Here's what makes this story genuinely fascinating instead of just a costume trivia fact: the doctors wearing this outfit had completely the wrong model of how plague spread. They thought it was bad air. It was actually fleas carried by rats, transmitting Yersinia pestis bacteria through bites, something science wouldn't confirm for another 275 years. But the physical response: cover exposed skin, filter incoming air, avoid direct contact, keep distance, turned out to be a reasonably effective barrier against disease transmission anyway, almost by accident. Wrong theory, right instinct. That's honestly the same basic logic behind modern hazmat suits and N95 respirators used by healthcare workers today. The materials changed. The science got dramatically more accurate. But the core idea, physically separate yourself from a contagious threat using full-body barriers, has barely changed in 400 years. So let's put it together. The plague doctor costume wasn't designed to be scary, it was designed by a royal physician, Charles Delorme, as functional protective equipment. The beak held herbs to filter air, based on the era's miasma theory. The glass lenses sealed off the eyes. The coat, gloves, and boots minimized skin exposure. And the cane let doctors examine patients from a safe distance. Wrong theory about disease. Genuinely early instinct for protective medicine. That's the real story behind the costume everyone thinks is just a Halloween prop. If this changed the way you'll see this costume every October from now on, that's exactly the kind of that's actually genius history I make videos about every week, so if you haven't already, subscribe, because next week I'm covering another piece of old-fashioned nonsense that turns out to have real science behind it. Here's a question for the comments: what other historical costume, object, or ritual do you think looks superstitious on the surface but might actually have real logic behind it? Which part of this surprised you the most?